Imagine logging onto your computer, typing this really highly complex query into a search engine, and having a state-of-the-art generative AI respond to you. And not in English, not in French, but in your native tongue.
Right.
And we are not talking about some clunky, word-for-word translation here. We are talking about a fluid, natural conversation in a language that carries your culture, your history, and your specific context.
That's a huge shift.
Yeah, it really is. For millions of people, that kind of seamless interaction just went from science fiction to reality. But, and this is why we're here today, this incredible moment of technological inclusion actually brings with it a massive structural catch.
Very subtle one, too.
Exactly. It's a catch that is actively redefining the digital future of an entire continent. So welcome to today's deep dive. You and I are exploring this fascinating article by the AI thought leader Johan Steyn. It's titled, Language Inclusion is Not Sovereignty, the Uncomfortable Question Behind Google's AI Update.
And Steyn is using a very specific piece of recent news here. Google adding 4 South African languages to its AI systems. He's using that as a lens to examine a much larger global friction point.
Which is just a brilliant framing.
It is. And to really get to the bottom of this for you, the listener, we are pulling from a pretty wide stack of sources today.
Yeah, we've got quite the reading list.
We do. Beyond Steyn's article, we are looking at a recent research paper and some really excellent Nigerian reporting on the WaxL language project. We're also examining a very stark January 2026 statement from the Pan-African Parliament, and finally, a November 2025 Axios report that details Mozilla's work on alternative data structures.
Before we jump into all that data, I have to point something out. I am looking at your setup right now, and the aesthetic hits the nail perfectly on the head.
Oh, the background.
Yeah, you've got these towering, classic wooden bookshelves, but they are wrapped in these faint, glowing digital data streams. It is literally the exact visual representation of what we are unpacking today.
I try to set the mood.
It works perfectly. It's this collision between deeply rooted cultural history and modern computing architecture. So as we do this, I will be guiding us through the mechanics of the tech and the cultural impact for everyone listening, while you are here to synthesize the underlying economics and the strategy. Help us figure out the why behind the headlines.
Sounds good. There is a lot of ground to cover between the software layer and the economic reality. Let's get into it.
All right, so the hook for Steyn's article is this recent update from Google. They have officially rolled out support for Afrikaans, isiZulu, Sesotho, and Setswana into their AI overviews, those generative AI summaries you see at the top of your search results.
Right, in their conversational AI mode.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Steyn establishes right away that this is a fundamentally good thing. He's not knocking it. It is a necessary feature update. The goal is to ensure people aren't locked out of the AI economy just because English isn't their primary language.
Users can now search, learn, and iterate in the language they actually think in. It expands the utility of the tool immensely for a massive population.
But Steyn uses this rollout to draw a very sharp line between two concepts that the tech industry often conflates: language inclusion and language sovereignty.
They sound similar, but economically they are worlds apart.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that distinction is really the engine driving this entire deep dive. Inclusion versus sovereignty. How are we defining the difference here?
What's fascinating here is how Steyn maps this onto the actual tech stack.
Yeah.
Because language inclusion happens at the interface layer.
Interface layer.
Yes, it means the platform supports your language. The user interface is localized, the AI can parse your native words, and the friction of using the product is removed. You feel included because the software speaks to you.
That makes sense.
But language sovereignty happens at the infrastructure layer. It is a fundamental question of ownership. Who owns the underlying training data? Who owns the server farms and the computational models processing that data?
Oh, I see.
Right. Who sets the parameters of the algorithm, and ultimately, who captures the recurring revenue generated by that system? A multinational firm can localize an interface flawlessly, but the value created by that system flows outward, back to the company's headquarters, not to the people whose language is powering the interaction.
Wow. Okay, to put that into a framework that might be familiar to you listening, especially if you've ever worked in software or systems architecture, it's very similar to the danger of building a business entirely on top of a proprietary API.
That's a great way to look at it.
Right. Imagine you build this fantastic software as a service product, and it completely relies on a third-party language model API to function. You have access to the outputs, your users are happy.
But you have zero sovereignty.
Zero. The API provider can change their model weights overnight, they can alter their content moderation filters, or they can hike the access price by 1,000%.
You own the wrapper, but they own the engine.
Exactly. And Steyn is arguing that entire linguistic populations are essentially becoming API wrappers for global tech platforms.
And that structural dependency is exactly what is triggering a massive strategic reaction at the continental level. If we look at that January 2026 statement from the Pan-African Parliament we mentioned earlier.
Right, the political side of this.
Yes, they publicly demanded African sovereignty over sensitive data and the AI systems built upon it. And they utilized a highly specific phrase to describe the current trajectory. They warned of a new era of data colonialism.
And we need to pause here and be explicitly clear with you listening. We are not taking a position on the Pan-African Parliament's specific political framing.
Absolutely not.
Whether you view the global expansion of tech platforms as a net positive for development, or you align with this parliament's intense pushback, our role is simply to report the reality of the debate as outlined in our sources.
We're just looking at the arguments on the table.
Precisely. But the fact that a major legislative body is using terms like data colonialism illustrates just how high the economic stakes are. This isn't just an academic debate about server locations anymore.
Not at all. It highlights the realization that data is the primary industrial resource of this century. And this raises an important question. Why is language the specific battleground for this resource?
Why not just financial data or geolocation?
Right. It comes down to the mechanics of how these models work. And this is where the linguistics get really fascinating. Language is not a simple one-to-one token exchange. You cannot just map an English sentence structure directly onto an isiZulu vocabulary and expect it to hold the exact same meaning.
Because it loses the context.
It loses everything. Language encodes a culture's relationship with time, its social hierarchies, its approach to community, its historical context. It is the operating system of a culture.
And Steyn points out that this leads to a massive structural risk, the flattening of cultural nuance.
Yes.
Think about how these AI systems are actually deployed in the real world. They summarize complex geopolitical events, they answer nuanced questions about history, and they help people make decisions. But the primary incentives for massive tech platforms are commercial.
They have to be.
They need to scale quickly and efficiently across the globe. So there's this natural incentive to train a single massive foundational model on a predominantly Western data set, and then simply build a translation layer on top of it for local languages.
I love how you phrase that. That is exactly the danger.
Mm-hmm.
Because it means the AI might generate a response with perfect Sesotho grammar, but the underlying logic, the assumptions about how the world works and the problem-solving approach are entirely imported from Silicon Valley.
It's a Western brain speaking a local language.
Exactly. It optimizes for Western individualism, even when speaking a language rooted in collective consensus. It is a very subtle homogenization of global knowledge. The AI isn't learning the culture. It is just dressing up its own worldview in local syntax.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because Steyn and our other sources don't just outline the failure state. They point to alternative architectures being built right now.
The pushback is already happening.
It is, and that brings us to the Waxel project.
Yeah.
Waxel is a massive African language speech corpus. And for those who might not be building machine learning pipelines every day, a speech corpus isn't just a folder of MP3s on a hard drive.
Far from it.
It is a highly structured, meticulously annotated data set of audio and text pairs. It teaches a model not just vocabulary, but the actual cadence, tone, and dialect of how humans naturally speak in a specific region.
And the Nigerian reporting on Waxel provides a crucial counter-narrative to the standard tech industry playbook. What makes Waxel significant is the methodology of its creation.
How they actually built it.
Right. It wasn't a case of a global tech firm flying in, scraping a bunch of data, and leaving. Local African universities and academic institutions were the primary architects of the project.
They were the ones in charge.
They designed the data collection protocols, they managed the annotation teams, and they built the local computing capacity to process it. They shifted their role from being passive providers of raw data to active researchers and stewards of their own linguistic resources.
They built the engine, not just the wrapper. It proves that the research and development capability actually exists locally. But even with a project like Waxel, which is championed as an open data set for researchers, the economics are still incredibly tricky.
They are, because the concept of open source in the AI space often functions as a one-way pipeline.
Explain that one-way pipeline.
Well, openly publishing a massive high-quality speech corpus is a huge benefit for global researchers and scrappy local startups. But the reality of the current market is that only trillion-dollar tech firms have the vast computational resources required to ingest that open data, integrate it into their massive proprietary closed models, and monetize it globally.
So the data is open, but the profit is closed.
Precisely. The local universities do all the heavy lifting of gathering and cleaning the cultural data, but they capture almost none of the financial upside when that data improves a commercial product. The data was open, but the value extraction was entirely asymmetric.
It is the ultimate free rider problem. The global giants subsidize their R&D using the open labor of local institutions.
Which is why the conversation among the policy experts and technologists is rapidly pivoting right now. They're moving away from simply demanding more open data to actively designing better deals.
Better deals.
Yes. The focus is shifting to consent frameworks, active governance over data sets, and establishing a fair exchange of value.
And we are seeing actual structural experiments trying to solve this asymmetry. Our sources point to a very detailed November 2025 Axios report about Mozilla. They are actively attempting to establish what they call a data sharing collective, or a data trust.
A data trust is a fascinating legal and technical mechanism. Instead of just dumping a data set onto the open internet for anyone to scrape, the data is held by a trust, a legal entity governed by the community that generated the data.
Okay.
So if a massive tech company wants to use that high-quality, localized corpus to train their commercial AI, they have to negotiate with the trust.
That changes the power dynamic completely.
It does. That might involve paying licensing fees, it might involve micro-royalties based on API usage, or it might require the tech company to guarantee free compute access for local developers. The trust mechanism gives the community actual leverage to ensure the value generated by their data flows back into their own ecosystem.
So what does this all mean? We've covered API dependencies, speech corpuses, and data trusts. But for you, the person listening right now, how does this actually hit the ground in the real world?
It touches almost every sector.
It really does. Steyn breaks the implications down into 3 specific areas, starting with policymakers.
For policymakers, Steyn's argument is that localized AI is no longer just a niche feature request. It is core industrial strategy.
Disinfrastructure.
Exactly. If a nation's native languages are going to form the foundational interface of the internet, that nation has to build local capability. They cannot rely entirely on foreign platforms. This means implementing data stewardship, which practically means building sovereign data centers, so sensitive cultural data doesn't leave the jurisdiction.
Keep the data at home.
Yes. It means creating national computing clusters, establishing rigorous evaluation metrics for model safety, and forming public-private partnerships designed explicitly to keep high-level machine learning skills from migrating out of the country.
It's treating data infrastructure the exact same way a country would treat its power grid or its telecommunications networks.
That's the perfect analogy.
So second, Steyn addresses business leaders. Obviously, having a native language generative AI is an incredible productivity tool for a local workforce, but it introduces a massive invisible risk surface into enterprise logic.
A huge risk.
If your employees start relying on localized AI, incredibly strict operational guidelines.
Because of the hallucination risk we discussed earlier, you cannot assume that because the output is grammatically flawless, the factual basis is sound.
Right.
Steyn uses a phrase in his piece that every operations executive should adopt. He says, trust is built through process, not optimism.
Oh, that's good.
If you deploy localized AI in an enterprise environment, you need human-in-the-loop verification protocols. You have to verify the source quality. You cannot outsource critical thinking to a system just because it speaks your language well.
Trust is built through process, not optimism. That is going on a Post-it note on my monitor.
It's a great rule to live by.
It is. Finally, the third group Steyn targets: educators and parents. And the promise here is undeniably powerful. A child can ask a complex question about physics or history and receive a patient, detailed explanation in the language they are most comfortable with.
It lowers the barrier to knowledge dramatically.
But the corresponding responsibility is immense. Humans have a psychological vulnerability to fluency.
We really do.
When a machine speaks our native language perfectly, utilizing our specific cultural idioms, our brains are hardwired to grant it immediate authority and trust. We inherently assume that because it speaks like us, it shares our context and our values.
Which means parents and educators have to actively teach an entirely new form of digital literacy. They have to train kids that language fluency does not equal factual truth.
Right.
An AI model can hallucinate a completely fabricated historical event or provide terrible scientific advice while using absolutely flawless Setswana. Breaking that illusion of authority requires deliberate, ongoing education.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the core takeaway from Steyn's analysis and the surrounding research is that true digital empowerment requires ownership of the foundations, not just access to the outputs.
Exactly. Google integrating these 4 South African languages is a genuine positive step for user accessibility.
No one is denying that.
Right. But if the global community stops there, if we confuse inclusion with sovereignty, we risk cementing a new tier of digital dependency. Local languages will merely serve as a resource to enrich distant, centralized systems, while the local capacity to shape, govern, and profit from those systems remains negligible.
It ultimately comes down to who controls the infrastructure underneath the interface. Now, before we wrap up today's deep dive, we want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own.
We spent a lot of time on the economics, the data trusts, and the compute power.
But consider the long-term cultural impact. Think about this. If an AI model, whose underlying logic, problem-solving architecture, and training data were primarily built on Western economic principles and individualistic values, is suddenly made perfectly fluent in Setswana or isiZulu, is it truly speaking the language?
That's the real question.
Or is it just flawlessly translating a foreign worldview into local words? And if millions of people start relying on that AI every single day for answers, advice, and summaries, how might that subtly rewrite a culture's own internal dialogue over the next few generations?
That is a profound question about the future of human knowledge.
It really is, and it's one we all need to be paying attention to. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it gave you a new framework for looking at the tech announcements hitting your feed. Keep exploring the systems underneath the surface, question the architecture you use every day, and above all, stay curious. We'll be right here waiting to unpack the next big idea with you.